The public downfall of Edith Piaf, the voice that loved too much and paid the price. The sparrow who flew too close to the sun. There was once a voice that made Paris weep. It came from a woman no taller than a child's dream, wrapped in a black dress, hands clenched at her sides, eyes wide as if she was staring into an open grave. Her name was Edith Piaf, the little sparrow, and for nearly 3 decades, she was France's most beloved wound. She sang of love like a woman who had been beaten by it, abandoned by it, resurrected by it, and then destroyed by it all over again. But the public did not see the destruction at first. They saw only the trembling lip, the tear that never quite fell, the way she could hold a note until it broke like a heart. They called her genius. They called her immortal. But immortality is a cruel joke for those who live on stage and die in hotel rooms. By the mid-1950s, the same crowds that had once thrown roses at her feet began to whisper. They saw the tracks on her arms before the television cameras learned to look away. They heard the slur between songs, the forgotten lyrics, the cough that lasted too long. They watched her marry a man young enough to be her son, then lose him to a plane crash that she somehow survived. And slowly, lovingly, cruelly, France began to turn its head. Not all at once. Not with malice. But with the quiet, inexorable disappointment that a nation reserves for a saint who forgot to stay holy. This is not the story of Edith Piaf's rise. That story has been told in sepia tones and nostalgic documentaries. This is the story of her fall, the public, humiliating, deeply human unraveling of a woman who loved too much, drank too much, injected too much, and paid for every moment of ecstasy with years of agony. It is a story told without scenes, without dialogue, without the false comfort of dramatic structure. It is simply what happened to a voice that refused to be silent even as its owner disappeared. The body betrays. By 1951, Edith Piaf was 35 years old, but her body believed it was 60. The car accident that nearly killed her in September of that year, a reckless swerve on the road between Paris and the Normandy coast, left her with 2 broken arms, several cracked ribs, and a newly intimate relationship with morphine. The doctors prescribed it for pain. She befriended it for peace. What the public did not know, as they read the newspaper headlines about their beloved sparrow's miraculous survival, was that the real miracle would have been her stopping. She did not stop. The first signs of public deterioration were physical, almost mechanical. She had always been small, barely 4 feet 8 inches, but now she seemed to shrink further, as if her spine were collapsing under the weight of her own legend. Her hands, once expressive and bird-like, began to shake during ballads. She developed a habit of clutching the microphone stand with both palms, not for dramatic effect but because she could no longer trust her own balance. The cough that had always been part of her stage persona, a throaty, almost sensual clearing between verses, deepened into something wet and worrying. Fellow performers noticed that she would sometimes disappear for 20 minutes between songs, returning with dilated pupils and a fresh scent of something chemical beneath her perfume. The concerts continued because the contracts demanded it and because Piaf herself did not know how to be anything other than unstage. But the quality of those concerts began to erode. In 1952, at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, her spiritual home, the place where she had once reduced an audience to collective sobbing with a single verse of Hymn à she forgot the words to La Vie en Rose. Not the obscure verses, but the chorus. The chorus that every French schoolchild could hum in their sleep. She stood there, microphone in hand, mouth open, and for 3 full seconds there was nothing but the hollow feedback of the sound system. Then she laughed, a brittle, desperate laugh, and the orchestra scrambled to cover her as she mumbled something about being tired. The audience laughed with her, because they loved her. But they also looked at each other afterward, uncertain. That uncertainty grew into concern and then into something uglier, pity. There is no force more corrosive to a performer's dignity than an audience's pity. Applause born of sympathy feels different from applause born of awe. It is slower, softer, more measured. Piaf could feel the difference in her bones. She had spent her entire career commanding rooms, first the squalid cabarets of Pigalle, then the grand theaters of New York and Paris. Now she was being tolerated, being forgiven, being watched the way one watches a once great athlete limp through a final season. She hated it, and her hatred drove her deeper into the arms of the needle. By 1953, the morphine had company. There was alcohol, not the celebratory champagne of her youth, but cheap cognac drunk from the bottle in dressing rooms. There were barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to perform, and whatever else her network of doctors-turned-dealers could supply. Her weight fluctuated wildly. Some months she looked almost healthy, cheeks rounded by corticosteroids. Other months she appeared as a skeleton in a black dress, clavicles sharp enough to cut light. The French press, still deferential in the early 50s, wrote around the truth. They called her fragile. They called her overworked. They called her a prisoner of her own sensitivity. They did not call her an addict, because France did not yet have a word for what she was becoming. The men who built and broke her. To understand Piaf's public downfall, one must understand the men. Not because she was defined by them, she was always, fiercely, her own creation, but because she loved them with a violence that the public could not ignore. Each love affair was a public spectacle, complete with tabloid headlines, tearful interviews, and, eventually, funerals. She collected men the way a pyromaniac collects matches, knowing each one would burn her, unable to stop striking them. The first great love was Yves Mornand, a young Italian immigrant with a jawline like a promise. She discovered him in 1944, made him a star, shared her stage with him, her bed, her connections, her everything. When he left her for the movies, for the actress, for the fame that she had given him and that now outgrew her, she did not merely grieve. She cratered. The public watched her perform L'hymne à l'amour as a direct address to a man who was no longer there, and they wept with her. But they also sensed something unseemly in the intensity. A woman who loved that much, they whispered, loves too much. And too much love is not romantic. It is frightening. Then came Marcel Cerdan, the middleweight boxing champion of the world. If Mornand had been a promising flame, Cerdan was a bonfire. He was married, Catholic, and wildly in love with her, or at least with the idea of her. Their affair was an open secret, romanticized by the press as a collision of two French titans, the voice and the fist. When Cerdan died in a plane crash in October 1949, en route from Paris to New York to see her, Piaf's grief became a national event. She recorded him à l'amour as a eulogy. She wore black for a year. She talked to his photograph before every performance. And the public, at first, adored her for it. A tragic widow, they thought. A woman who had loved and lost. How very French. How very beautiful. But grief does not stay beautiful for long. It curdles into obsession, then into self-destruction. Piaf never stopped talking about Cerdan. Even a decade later, in interviews, she would refer to him as her true husband, her only love, the man who had died because of her. Because, she believed, if she had not insisted he visit her in New York, he would still be alive. This belief, this corrosive guilt, became the engine of her self-punishment. Every needle mark was an apology. Every missed note was a prayer. The public eventually tired of the performance of grief. By the mid-50s, when she mentioned Cerdan in an interview, fans no longer reached for their handkerchiefs. They reached for the remote control. The final, most bewildering public relationship was with Charles Aznavour, her protégé and sometime lover, and then, most shockingly of all, with Theo Serapo, a Greek hairdresser 20 years her junior whom she married in a secret civil ceremony in 1962. She was 46. He was 26. The public did not know what to do with this. Was it romance? Charity? Delusion? The photographs from the wedding show Piaf looking exhausted and triumphant, her new husband boyishly handsome and visibly nervous. The press ran the images with captions that strained for tenderness but landed on something closer to pity. The sparrow finds a nest, one headline read. Another, crueler, she could be his mother. She married Serapo not out of delusion but out of a desperate, lucid awareness that she was dying. She wanted someone to hold her hand at the end. She wanted to feel, one last time, that she was capable of being loved. But the public saw only the grotesque mismatch of ages and health. They did not see the hospital rooms, the abscesses, the nights when she could not breathe without a machine. They saw a woman clutching at youth like a drowning woman clutching at seaweed. And they looked away. The stage as confession booth. By 1956, the Olympia concerts had become endurance tests for everyone involved. Piaf would arrive 2 hours late, if she arrived at all. When she did appear, she often performed in a fog, eyes unfocused, gestures mechanical, the great voice that had once shattered chandeliers now reduced to a whisper with occasional shards of power. The set lists shrank from 20 songs to 12 to 8. The encores became perfunctory. The standing ovations became seated ones. But here is the paradox that defined her downfall. Even at her worst, Piaf could still, in brief flashes, be the greatest singer who ever lived. Every few concerts, something would break through the morphine and the exhaustion and the cirrhosis. A single phrase of "My Lord" would land with such devastating clarity that the entire audience would gasp. A verse of "Non, je ne regrette rien," recorded in 1960 as a defiant middle finger to her own decay, would ring out with such ferocious conviction that for 3 minutes, everyone believed her. She regretted nothing. She would start again from zero. She was invincible. Then the song would end, and she would collapse back into her body, and the audience would remember, this was not a resurrection. It was a haunting. The critics grew sharper as the decade turned. In 1959, a review in Le Figaro described her performance as the sound of a legend eating itself alive. Another, in François, noted that the little sparrow now sings like a bird with a broken wing, moving, yes, but no longer beautiful. These were not the words of enemies. They were the words of former admirers, writing with the particular cruelty of those who feel betrayed by a hero's mortality. Piaf read every review. She claimed not to care, but she read them, and she remembered them, and she punished herself for them. Between 1958 and 1962, she was hospitalized more than a dozen times, for pneumonia, for liver failure, for gastrointestinal hemorrhages, for withdrawal seizures when she attempted and failed to quit morphine. Each hospitalization was leaked to the press, sometimes by her own manager, because bad publicity was still publicity and she needed the money for her next dose. The headlines became a grim chronicle: Piaf collapses on stage, Piaf rushed to clinic, Piaf's health serious but stable. The word stable appeared so often that it lost all meaning. She was stable the way a house fire is stable, still burning, not yet ash. The final concerts. In 1962, against every doctor's advice, Piaf agreed to a series of concerts at the Olympia. She was now so ill that she could barely walk. She had to be carried to the microphone by Serapo and a stagehand. Her liver was 3 times its normal size. Her joints were deformed by arthritis. She coughed blood into handkerchiefs between songs. But she insisted on performing because she did not know how to die in silence. The first night was a catastrophe of sympathy. She forgot the second verse of Mon Dieu. She stopped in the middle of La Foule to catch her breath, and the silence stretched for so long that the conductor began the next song without her. She looked at the audience with an expression that was half apology, half defiance. They applauded anyway, not because she had earned it, but because they could not bear to do otherwise. After the concert, A young fan wrote in her diary, "I saw Piaf tonight. I think I saw a dead person singing." The second night was better. Or worse, depending on your definition. She had adjusted her medication, more amphetamines, less morphine, and the result was a jittery, hyper-alert performance that had none of her usual depth but plenty of her usual volume. She shouted rather than sang. She paced the stage like a caged animal. The critics called it frenzied and unsettling. One wrote that watching Piaf perform now is like watching someone set fire to her own furniture to stay warm. The third night, she cancelled. The fourth night, she performed 2 songs and then fainted. The fifth night, the final night of the run, she did something extraordinary. She sang Non, Je ne regrette rien, as if her life depended on it, which it did. She sang it without irony, without self-pity, without the slightest acknowledgement that she was, in fact, a woman drowning in regrets. She sang it as a statement of fact. And for 4 minutes, everyone believed her. Then she walked offstage, supported by Serapo shuffling like an old woman, and never performed at the Olympia again. The public watches her die. The last year of Edith Piaf's life was a slow, public undressing. She had always been private about her body, the black dresses that covered everything, the long sleeves that hid the needle marks. But in 1963, there was no hiding left. She was photographed leaving clinics in a wheelchair, her face swollen from cortisone, her eyes vacant. She gave interviews from her hospital bed, the microphone positioned so that her labored breathing would not be audible. She talked about future projects, a film, an album, an American tour, that everyone knew would never happen. The French public watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. This was not the dignified decline of a national treasure. This was a car crash in slow motion. Every week brought new rumors. She was blind, she was paralyzed, she had lost her voice entirely, she had been found unconscious in an apartment with a needle still in her arm. Some of the rumors were true. Most were not. But the truth had become irrelevant. What mattered was the image, the little sparrow, fallen from the nest, pecking at the ground. In September 1963, she fell into a coma. She emerged after several days, lucid but fragile. She asked for Serapo. She asked for a priest. She asked, according to legend, for a glass of cognac. She did not get it. The press camped outside the clinic in Neuilly-sur-Seine, filing updates every few hours. The updates grew shorter and more dire. Piaf resting, then Piaf weakening, then Piaf unconscious. On October 10, 1963, at 10:20 in the morning, the announcement came: Edith Piaf was dead. She was 47 years old. But here is the final cruelty: the public did not mourn her alone. On that same day, October 10, 1963, Jean Cocteau, the poet, filmmaker, and legendary figure of French arts, also died. His death, at 74, was sudden but not unexpected. He had been ill. The French newspapers faced an impossible choice: which obituary to run on the front page. In the end, they ran both. But Cocteau, the intellectual, the artist's artist, the man of letters, received the longer tributes. Piaf, the gutter singer, the sparrow, the addict, the woman who loved too much, was relegated to second place even in death. The funeral, held on October 14 at the cemetery of Père Lachaise, drew more than 40,000 people. They blocked the streets of Paris for hours. They wept openly. They sang La Vie en Rose, in a collective murmur that rose like incense. But even then, even in that moment of pure grief, there was something uneasy in the air. These were not mourners celebrating a life. These were witnesses to a catastrophe, come to see the wreckage up close. They had watched her destroy herself for years, and they had done nothing, could do nothing, because she had refused to be saved. And now they stood in the rain, crying for a woman they had already buried a dozen times in their minds. The price of loving too much. What did Edith Piaf pay for her loves? She paid with her body, which became a prison of pain and withdrawal and disease. She paid with her voice, which by the end was a ghost of what it had been, still moving, still capable of transcendence, but only in brief, agonizing flashes. She paid with her public reputation, which transformed from adoration to pity to a kind of exhausted tolerance. She paid with her death, which was not the peaceful fade out of a legend but a choking, sweating, terrified gasping for air in a sterile room. And yet, listen to any regret Reen today, really listen, not as nostalgia but as a document of human will, and you will hear something extraordinary. You will hear a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, who understood that every needle, every drink, every doomed love affair was a choice, and who refused to apologize for any of it. The song is not a confession. It is a manifesto. She swept her memory clean. She started again from zero. She regretted nothing. The public wanted her to regret. They wanted her to be a cautionary tale, a moral lesson about the dangers of excess and the wages of passion. But she would not give them that satisfaction. Even as her body failed, even as the reviews turned cruel, even as France looked away from the spectacle of her dying, she sang the same defiant message: no regret. No regret. No regret. That is the true story of her public downfall. It is not a tragedy of weakness. It is a tragedy of stubborn, self-aware, magnificent refusal to change. She loved too much because that was the only way she knew how to love. She drank and injected and performed herself to death because the alternative, a quiet, sensible, moderate life, was a fate worse than dying. The public turned away because they could not bear to watch a woman choose her own destruction with such clear eyes. But she never asked them to watch. She asked only that they listen. And they did. They still do. The reckoning, what the public never understood. The silence after the funeral. 40,000 people had come to Pelakis. 40,000 strangers who had never held her hand, never sat with her through a withdrawal seizure, never watched her beg a doctor for just one more injection to stop the shaking. They came with flowers and candles and vinyl records pressed to their chests. They came because they had loved her voice. But love, as Piaf knew better than anyone, is not the same as understanding. In the weeks after her burial, the tributes poured in from every corner of French culture. Charles Aznavour, her former lover and lifelong friend, gave an interview in which he broke down twice, unable to finish sentences about the woman who had taught him everything. Jacques Brel called her the only singer who ever told the truth. Even Charles de Gaulle, not known for sentimentality, reportedly said, "She sang our suffering better than we could feel it ourselves." These were beautiful words. They were also useless. They arrived too late, as such words always do. The newspapers that had printed her hospitalizations as gossip now printed her obituaries as poetry. Le Monde ran a front-page essay comparing her to Baudelaire, another French genius who had drunk himself into an early grave. François published a sentimental retrospective titled "The Sparrow Flies Home." None of them mentioned the morphine by name. None of them acknowledged that they had helped kill her, that every cruel headline, every whispered speculation, every photograph of her gaunt face had been a small knife in a death by 1,000 cuts. The press mourned her the way a hunter mourns a deer, with genuine sadness and absolute refusal to stop aiming. The myth of the tragic heroine. Within a year of her death, the transformation began. Edith Piaf, the addicted, self-destructive, difficult, demanding, impossible woman, became Edith Piaf, the tragic heroine of French song. The process was as predictable as it was cynical. Her flaws were recast as passion. Her addictions were rebranded as sensitivity. Her public unraveling was rewritten as a noble sacrifice to art. A biographer wrote that she had given her body to the songs, note by note, until there was nothing left. Another claimed that her suffering was the price of authenticity, as if authenticity were a toll booth and she had simply paid it. Piaf herself would have hated this. She had no interest in sainthood. She was not a martyr for music. She was a woman who liked cognac and men and the feeling of a needle slipping into her vein because it made the pain stop, if only for an hour. That was not noble. That was not tragic. That was simply human. But the public needed her to be more than human. They needed her to be a story they could tell themselves about the cost of greatness, because if her suffering had meaning, then their own suffering might have meaning too. If she had died for art, then perhaps art was worth dying for. It was a comforting lie. And France embraced it completely. The children she never had. There is one aspect of Piaf's public downfall that is almost never discussed, because it is too painful and too private. But it belongs here, in a reckoning of what she lost. She wanted children. Desperately. The daughter she had born at 17, Marcel, called Cécile, had died of meningitis at 2 years old, while Piaf was on tour, singing for strangers. She never forgave herself for not being there. She never stopped believing that if she had stayed home, held her daughter closer, noticed the fever earlier, everything would have been different. After that, she could not have more children. The car accidents, the diseases, the malnutrition, her body had been battered into infertility. She told interviewers that she did not mind, that her music was her child, that the stage was her family. But those who knew her well heard something else in the silences between those words. They heard a woman who sang Mon Dieu, my God, with such devastating tenderness because she was singing to a God who had taken her daughter and given her nothing but fame in return. The public never knew this. They saw her childlessness as liberation, the free-spirited artist, unencumbered by diapers and school runs. They did not see her in hotel rooms at 3 a.m, clutching a photograph of a baby who would now be a woman if she had lived. They did not see the way she sometimes stared at young girls in the audience, her eyes soft with a longing she could never name. That was not part of the public downfall. That was a private one. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. The public saw only half of her suffering, and even that half, they misunderstood. The voice that would not die. Here is what the public did understand, even if they could not articulate it. Piaf's voice, at its best, was not a performance of emotion. It was emotion itself, stripped of all distance. When she sang La Vie en Rose, you did not hear a woman describing happiness. You heard happiness, fragile, fleeting, almost certainly doomed, but real for the duration of the song. When she sang L'hymne à l'amour, you did not hear a woman grieving Marcel Cerdan. You heard grief, raw and unprocessed, still bleeding. Her voice was a direct line from her central nervous system to your eardrums. There was no filter, no technique, no artifice. Just a small woman in a black dress, opening her mouth, and letting the truth fall out. That is why her downfall was so public. Not because she was famous. Many famous people have destroyed themselves in private, behind closed doors, with dignity and discretion. But Piaf could not destroy herself in private because she had no private self left. The voice that sang of love and loss was the same voice that slurred through interviews. The hands that had held microphones trembled from withdrawal. The eyes that had wept on stage were bloodshot from the same thing that made her weep. She did not have two lives, one public and one private. She had one life, and she lived it in front of everyone, and everyone watched. Some performers are actors. They put on a persona when the lights go up, and they take it off when the lights go down. Piaf had no persona. She had only herself, offered up night after night, whether the audience wanted her or not. That was her gift and her curse. It made her the greatest singer of her generation. And it made her destruction impossible to hide. The men who survived her. Theo Serapo, her young husband, did not speak publicly for 6 months after her death. When he finally gave an interview, he said very little. "She was not a legend to me," he said. "She was my wife. She burned herself to keep me warm. I could not stop her." He died in a car accident 7 years later, at 32. He was buried next to her in Palacis. Even in death, he could not leave her side. Charles Aznavour lived another 55 years, becoming one of the most celebrated singers in French history. He rarely spoke of Piaf in interviews, but when he did, his voice changed. It became smaller, younger, more uncertain. "She made me," he once said. "And then she let me go. That was her way. She loved you completely, and then she moved on, because she could not bear to be loved back. Being loved back meant being seen. And she did not want to be seen. She wanted to be needed." Marcel Cerdan's widow never forgave Piaf for the affair. In a memoir published in 1970, she wrote that Piaf had stolen a husband and a father, and then turned his death into a song. It was a harsh judgment, but not an unfair one. Piaf had indeed turned Cerdan's death into art. Beautiful, moving, commercially successful art. She had profited from his corpse. That was not love. That was something more complicated, more uncomfortable. A woman who could only process loss by singing it, who could only grieve in front of an audience, who had no other way to feel her own feelings except by making strangers feel them too. Eve Mornand, the first great love, outlived her by nearly 3 decades. When asked in 1985 what he remembered most about Piaf, he did not mention her voice or her talent. He mentioned her hands. "They were always moving," he said. "Reaching for something. A cigarette, a drink, a man, a microphone. She could not be still. Stillness was death to her. And in the end, she was right." The medical truth they hid. The official cause of death was liver failure due to cirrhosis. That was true, as far as it went. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that her body had been under siege for 20 years, from malnutrition in childhood, from tuberculosis that had scarred her lungs, from multiple car accidents that had fractured her spine and ribs, from morphine and alcohol and barbiturates and amphetamines, from the sheer relentless grind of performing 300 nights a year while never eating a proper meal. She died of Edith Piaf. That was the disease. There was no cure. What the public never knew, what the doctors kept from the press out of a misguided sense of dignity, was the state of her body at the end. Her liver was not merely cirrhotic. It was necrotic, chunks of it dead and black. Her lungs were held together by scar tissue. Her joints were so arthritic that she could not lift a glass of water without help. She had the bones of an 8-year-old woman. And yet, 3 days before she fell into her final coma, she had asked for a microphone. She had wanted to record one more song. She had written new lyrics on a napkin, in handwriting so shaky that only Serapo could read them. The song was called À quoi sert l'amour? What good is love? She never recorded it. She ran out of time. The legacy of a downfall. Today, more than 60 years after her death, Edith Piaf is remembered as an icon. Her face appears on postage stamps. Her songs are covered by everyone from Madonna to Andrea Bocelli. A biopic starring Marion Cotillard won an Academy Award. Tourists visit her grave in Palacis and leave metro tickets and wine corks and love notes. She has been sanitized, commodified, turned into a brand. The little sparrow now sells perfume. But if you dig beneath the surface of that legacy, if you read the old interviews, the police reports from her overdoses, the hospital records that were leaked decades later, you find something different. You find a woman who was not a saint, not a martyr, not a brand. You find a woman who was often cruel to those who loved her, who stole from friends to buy drugs, who abandoned protégés when they became successful, who lied compulsively about her age and her health and her past. You find a woman who was, in other words, a mess. A glorious, talented, infuriating, self-destructive mess. The public downfall was real. She did destroy herself in full view of the world. She did love too much, drink too much, inject too much, and pay the price. But here is what the public, in its rush to mourn and then to forget, never fully understood. She knew. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was not a victim of her passions. She was their willing servant. She chose every cigarette, every cognac, every needle, every doomed affair. She chose them because the alternative, a long, quiet, respectable life, was not a life she recognized. She was not built for moderation. She was built for flames. And flames, by their nature, burn out. The last unspoken truth. There is a photograph taken of Piaf in 1962, less than a year before her death. She is sitting in a wheelchair on the terrace of a clinic in the south of France. Her face is puffy from medication, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her mouth set in a line that is neither smile nor frown. Behind her, through the blur of the camera's limited depth of field, you can see the Mediterranean Sea, blue, endless, indifferent. She is looking at the sea, or perhaps through it, at something only she can see. What was she thinking in that moment? We will never know. But we can guess. She was thinking about Marcel Cerdan, probably. About the plane that took him. About the daughter who died while she sang. About the thousands of nights on stage, the millions of hands that had applauded her, the billions of notes she had sung. She was thinking about the next injection, and the next, and the next. She was thinking about Serapo, waiting inside with a cup of tea and a worried face. She was thinking about the song she would never finish. And then, because she was Edith Piaf, because she had spent her entire life turning pain into performance, she probably smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a sad smile. A smile that said, I know what you see when you look at me. You see a downfall. You see a tragedy. You see a warning. But I am none of those things. I am a woman who lived exactly as she wanted to live, who loved exactly as she wanted to love, who is dying exactly as she always knew she would. And if you cannot understand that, the problem is not mine. She died 3 months later. The photograph remained. The sea remained. The songs remained. And the public, finally, silently, remained with their questions. Could she have been saved? Should we have tried harder? Did we love her too little, or too much, or in the wrong way entirely? There are no answers to these questions. There is only the voice, preserved on vinyl, singing across the decades. Any regret rien. No, I regret nothing. And in the end, that is not a downfall. That is a victory. The only kind that mattered to her. What the sparrow left behind. She left behind no fortune. The money had been spent on drugs, doctors, lawyers, and the endless legal battles over royalties. She left behind no children, no memoirs, no authorized biography. She left behind a wardrobe of black dresses, a collection of hats, a handful of love letters tied with ribbon, and a golden microphone that had been a gift from the Olympia Theatre. She left behind, most importantly, 243 recorded songs. Some of them are masterpieces. Some of them are barely listenable, her voice cracking, the orchestra out of sync, the production value of a basement recording session. But even the bad ones are true. Even the bad ones contain some fragment of her, some moment of unguarded feeling that no other singer could replicate. She did not know how to fake it. That was her greatness. That was her destruction. That was her gift to everyone who would come after her, searching for a voice that could make them feel less alone. The public downfall of Edith Piaf is not a story about a singer who lost her way. It is a story about a world that watched a woman lose her way and called it entertainment. She paid the price for loving too much. But the audience paid nothing. They simply turned off their radios and went to bed. And in the morning, they woke up to a world without her voice in it, quieter, duller, and too ashamed to admit that they had helped silence her. She would not have wanted your shame. She would have wanted you to listen. So listen. Put on him à l'amour. Put on non, any regret rien. Put on anything she ever sang, and hear her not as a cautionary tale but as a woman who lived, burned, and left behind something that cannot be extinguished. That is the final truth. That is the only truth that matters. Fin.